If you dare to explore the darkest mysteries, subscribe now to Ghost Whispers. Late night stranger in the patio. I woke up earlier than usual that morning, sometime around 5 a.m. I don't know what exactly woke me up. Maybe the sound of the old house settling, or just one of those random moments where you're yanked out of sleep for no reason. Either way, I was wide awake. I remember lying there for a while, staring at the ceiling, debating whether to get up or try to force myself back to sleep. It wasn't until I heard the faintest noise, like a shuffling sound, that I sat up. At first, I thought it might have been the wind. The patio furniture sometimes creaks if the breeze is strong enough. But something about it didn't sit right. It sounded too deliberate, like footsteps, but slow and uneven. My heart started to race as I strained to listen for anything else. I live alone in a small house in a pretty quiet neighborhood. It's the kind of place where you don't expect anything out of the ordinary to happen. But as I got out of bed and walked toward the window facing the backyard, I felt this wave of unease wash over me. I don't usually scare easily, but something about the air that morning felt wrong. I peered through the blinds, and at first, I didn't see anything. The patio was mostly in shadow, with just a faint glow from the porch light I'd left on overnight. Then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw him. There was a man slumped over on one of the chairs, his head resting awkwardly on the table. For a second, I thought he might be dead. At first, I didn't recognize him. My brain was still trying to process what I was looking at. He was wearing a hoodie, the kind with the drawstring pulled tight, and I could just make out his face in the dim light. My first thought was maybe he was homeless and had wandered onto my property to sleep. I felt a weird mix of fear and pity, mostly fear. I mean, what are you supposed to do in a situation like that? My phone was on the nightstand, and I thought about calling the police, but something stopped me. Instead, I just stood there, frozen, watching him. That's when he moved. Not a lot, just a slight twitch of his arm, but it was enough to make me jump back from the window. And then it hit me. I did know him. It was the guy who'd harassed me a few weeks earlier. I didn't even know his name, but I'll never forget his face. He'd approached me in the parking lot of the grocery store one evening, asking for money. At first, I thought he was just being pushy, but when I said no, he got nasty fast. He followed me to my car, yelling all kinds of stuff I don't even want to repeat. I managed to get in and lock the doors before he could do anything, but the whole thing left me shaken for days. And now, somehow, he was on my patio. My stomach turned as I realized that this wasn't some random coincidence. I backed away from the window, my hands shaking so badly I could barely think straight. The first thing I did was grab my phone. My fingers fumbled as I opened the camera app and snapped a picture of him through the blinds, just in case I needed proof later. Then I called 911. My voice was barely above a whisper as I explained the situation to the operator, trying to keep calm but failing miserably. She told me to stay on the line and lock myself in a room until the police arrived. I couldn't take my eyes off the patio, though. Every second felt like an eternity, and I kept expecting him to wake up or, worse, come to the door. But he didn't move. He just stayed there, slumped over like he was passed out. I started to wonder if he was drunk, or maybe on something. Either way, I didn't feel safe. My mind was racing with every horrible possibility. What if he'd been watching me? What if he'd followed me home that night at the grocery store and waited weeks to make his move? The thought made my skin crawl. The operator's voice brought me back to the present. She said the officers were just a few minutes away, but those minutes felt like hours. I was too scared to even look out the window again. When the police finally arrived, I heard the knock at my front door before I saw the lights. I had to work up the courage to cross the living room and let them in. The two officers moved quickly, asking me to stay inside while they checked the patio. Through the small gap in the curtains, I watched as they approached him cautiously. One of them shined a flashlight directly in his face, and that's when he stirred. He didn't jump up or act startled. He just kind of lifted his head slowly, like he was waking up from a nap. I couldn't hear what was being said, but I could see him gesturing, like he was trying to explain himself. After a few tense minutes, one of the officers came back to the door to talk to me. He asked if I knew the man, and I told him about the grocery store incident. He nodded like that was exactly what he expected to hear. Apparently, the guy had been in trouble before, mostly for loitering and minor stuff, but nothing violent. Still, the officer said it was good I called because it sounded like this wasn't a random thing. They searched him and found nothing suspicious. No weapons, just an old wallet and some loose change. I felt a small wave of relief, but it didn't last long. The officers escorted him off the property, but not before he glanced up at the house. His eyes locked onto mine through the window for just a second. It wasn't an angry look or even one of recognition. It was blank, like he was staring through me. That moment sent a shiver down my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. After he was gone, the police reassured me that they'd patrol the area for the rest of the night and advised me to call if anything else happened. I nodded and thanked them, but the second they left, the silence in the house felt suffocating. I double-checked every lock in the house, pulled all the curtains shut, and sat in the middle of my living room with the lights on, clutching my phone. Sleep wasn't even an option. I kept replaying the look on his face over and over in my head. Why had he come back? Was it some sick coincidence, or had he been watching me this whole time? I didn't have answers, just a growing sense of unease. Every little noise, the hum of the fridge, the creak of the floorboards, made me jump. By the time the sun started to rise, I felt like I was losing my mind. By mid-morning, I thought I'd start to feel better, but the opposite happened. I couldn't shake the paranoia. I kept peeking out the windows, expecting to see him standing there. Even though I knew the police had taken him away, the thought of him coming back kept gnawing at me. Around noon, I stepped outside to water the plants on the patio, hoping to distract myself. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There was a cigarette, but sitting on the edge of the table where he'd been slumped over. I don't smoke, and I was certain it wasn't there the night before. It wasn't just that, it was still fresh, like it hadn't been there long enough to get rained on or blow away. I grabbed it with a paper towel and threw it in the trash, but it was too late. That small, insignificant detail had completely undone me. If he'd been awake before the police came, how long had he been sitting there? Was he watching me from the shadows? Did he see me through the window while I was standing there frozen? My mind went into overdrive, piecing together scenarios that only made me feel worse. That's when I decided to install cameras around the house. I didn't care how much it cost. I needed to know if someone was lurking around. The cameras were installed the next day, and for a while, I thought that would help me sleep at night. But every time I checked the footage, I found myself holding my breath, expecting to see him in the background. The first few nights were quiet. Nothing out of the ordinary. I started convincing myself that maybe he'd been taken far enough away, or maybe he wasn't interested in coming back. Then, about a week later, I saw something that still makes my skin crawl. Around 3 a.m., the camera facing the patio caught movement, a shadow passing along the edge of the frame. It was quick, almost too quick to notice, but I knew what I saw. I rewound the footage, zooming in as much as I could, but it was grainy and dark. All I could make out was the faint outline of someone walking away from the house. That was the last time I stayed in that house alone. I packed up and moved out within a month, breaking my lease and eating the penalty fees just to get away. To this day, I don't know if it was him, but I can't shake the feeling that it was. Sometimes, I catch myself looking over my shoulder when I'm out, half expecting to see that blank, unsettling stare. The cameras, the police, the locked doors. None of it made me feel safe. It's been over a year now, and I still can't explain why he was on my patio that night or what he really wanted. All I know is, I'll never forget how powerless and exposed I felt, and I hope I never have to feel that way again. Trail follower. I don't even know why I'm writing this. Maybe just to get it out of my system, or maybe because if I'd seen a story like this before, I would have made different choices that night. Either way, here it goes. It happened about 3 weeks ago, and honestly, I still can't sleep right. Every little sound in the night sends my heart racing like it's about to happen all over again. So, I've always been someone who loves nighttime walks. There's this trail near my house. Nothing fancy, just a gravel path that cuts through some woods and loops around a small pond. It's peaceful, quiet, and I've never felt unsafe there before. That night was no different. I grabbed my headphones, threw on my hoodie, and headed out around 9:30. It was chilly, but the air felt fresh, and the trail was empty like usual. Perfect, or so I thought. I'd barely made it 5 minutes in when I got this weird feeling. You know that sense that you're not alone? I brushed it off at first, thinking it was just my imagination playing tricks on me in the dark. But then I heard it. Soft footsteps behind me, faint but definitely there. I stopped walking, and the sound stopped too. For a second, I laughed at myself, thinking, okay, you're just being paranoid. I even looked back, but there was nothing. Just empty trail and shadows from the trees. I turned back around and kept walking, but that's when I heard it again, closer this time. This time, my stomach dropped. I didn't want to look back again, but I couldn't help it. Slowly, I turned my head, and there was someone. They were maybe 20 or 30 feet behind me, just barely visible in the dim light from the few trail lamps scattered along the path. It was a man, wearing a dark jacket with the hood up. He wasn't running or anything, just walking. Too close for comfort. I tried to calm myself down. It's probably just someone else on the trail, I thought. No big deal. But my gut wouldn't let it go. I picked up my pace a little, not enough to look like I was panicking, but enough to put some distance between us. That's when I noticed his footsteps quicken too, matching mine exactly. My chest felt tight, and my hands started shaking. At that point, I knew something was wrong. I tried to act normal, but my mind was racing. Should I call someone? Run. Confront him. I didn't want to jump to conclusions and embarrass myself if it was nothing, but my instincts were screaming at me to get out of there. I kept walking faster, practically speed walking now, and I could hear him keeping up, his steps crunching the gravel just a little too close. That's when I made the decision to veer off the trail. There's a small path that cuts through the trees and leads back to the neighborhood, and I figured if I could make it there, I'd be safe. As I headed for the shortcut, I glanced back one last time. That's when I saw him clearly for the first time. His hood had slipped back a bit, and I could see his face, a blank, expressionless stare that made my blood run cold. He wasn't just following me. He was focused, like I was some kind of target. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This guy wasn't just some random night walker. He was after me. I broke into a run, and so did he. My heart was pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. The sound of my breathing, the crunch of gravel under my feet. The shortcut wasn't far, but it felt like it was miles away. I could hear him gaining on me, his footsteps getting louder, faster. I've never been athletic, but adrenaline does crazy things. I sprinted harder than I ever have in my life, practically throwing myself into the trees when I reached the path. The trail was narrow and dark, with branches clawing at my face and clothes as I pushed through. I didn't dare look back. All I could do was focus on getting to the street, where there'd be lights, houses, people, safety. But the guy wasn't giving up. I could hear him crashing through the brush behind me, not even trying to be quiet anymore. I was terrified, shaking so hard I thought I'd trip over my own feet. The shortcut felt endless, like I was running in a nightmare where the exit keeps moving farther away. Finally, I saw the faint glow of streetlights through the trees, and I felt a flicker of hope. Just a few more steps, I told myself. I burst out of the woods onto the pavement, panting so hard I thought I'd pass out. I looked around, desperate for any sign of help, but the street was eerily empty. No cars, no people, just the quiet hum of the nearby houses. I didn't stop, though. I kept running, heading straight for the closest house with its porch light on. I banged on the door like a maniac, yelling for someone to help me. My throat was dry, and my voice cracked, but I didn't care. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep pounding on the door. For a few horrifying seconds, nothing happened. Then the porch light flickered on, and a middle-aged man opened the door just a crack. He looked half asleep and confused, but as soon as he saw my face, he opened it wider. Before I could say anything, I turned and pointed back toward the woods. The guy wasn't there anymore. The path was empty, as if he'd vanished into thin air. My heart was still racing, and I was shaking so hard I could barely stand. I tried to explain to the man what had happened, stumbling over my words, but he seemed to understand enough. He ushered me inside and locked the door behind me. Then he grabbed his phone and called the cops while I just sat there on his couch, trying to catch my breath and wrap my head around what had just happened. When the police showed up, I told them everything. The guy's face, the way he followed me, how he chased me through the woods. They searched the trail and the surrounding area but didn't find anyone. One of the officers mentioned there had been reports of suspicious activity on the trail recently, linked to human trafficking. Hearing that made my stomach turn. If I hadn't gotten away, who knows what would have happened to me? After the police left, I stayed at the man's house for a little while, mostly because I was too scared to walk home alone. He was kind enough to drive me back, and the whole time I couldn't stop looking out the windows, half expecting to see that guy standing somewhere in the dark, watching. But we didn't see anything. When I finally got inside, I locked every door and window and left all the lights on. I didn't sleep that night, not even for a minute. Every sound made me jump, and every shadow looked like him. The worst part is that they never caught the guy. I followed up with the police a few days later, but they had no leads. They told me to avoid the trail for a while and be cautious, which felt like the understatement of the year. I haven't been back there since, and honestly, I don't think I ever will. Just the thought of it makes my skin crawl. I still don't know what he wanted or how long he'd been following me before I noticed him, and that's what haunts me the most. It's like a part of me will always be looking over my shoulder now, wondering if he's still out there, waiting for his next chance. Pete/John the Stalker. I don't usually go for late-night walks, but that night I just needed to clear my head. My parents had been fighting again, and the walls in our house are way too thin to block out their yelling. So I grabbed my hoodie, shoved my phone in my pocket, and left. It was just past midnight, and our neighborhood was eerily quiet. No cars, no barking dogs, just the hum of a street lamp flickering at the corner. I remember thinking how peaceful it felt compared to the chaos back home. That's when I saw him, a guy in his late 20s or early 30s standing by the park gate. He was smoking, his face mostly hidden by the glow of his cigarette, but when he noticed me walking by, he smiled and nodded like he knew me. I nodded back, not wanting to be rude, and kept walking. About 5 minutes later, I realized I could still hear footsteps behind me. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid, but when I glanced over my shoulder, there he was, the same guy from the park, walking maybe 20 feet behind me. My heart started racing, but I told myself it was just a coincidence. I mean, it's a free sidewalk, right? I sped up a little, trying to put some distance between us, but every time I turned around, he was still there. Not closer, not farther, just there. Finally, I reached my street and darted into my driveway without looking back. I stayed by the window for a while, peeking through the blinds, but I didn't see him again that night. The next morning, I'd almost convinced myself I had overreacted. Maybe he just happened to live nearby or was heading in the same direction. But around lunchtime, I got the first text. It was from an unknown number. "Hey, saw you last night. Cool hoodie." My stomach dropped. There was no way this was a coincidence. I didn't reply, hoping he'd just lose interest, but then the texts kept coming. "You live on Elm Street, right? We should hang out sometime." He never said his name or explained how he got my number, and every new message made my skin crawl. I showed them to my best friend, Matt, and he thought it was funny, saying I should mess with the guy. But this didn't feel like a joke. That evening, I blocked the number, thinking that would be the end of it. But around 2 a.m., my phone started ringing. I didn't recognize the number, but I had a sinking feeling I already knew who it was. I didn't answer. He called 3 more times before finally leaving a voicemail. When I listened to it, I almost dropped my phone. His voice was calm but weirdly friendly, like we were old buddies. "Hey, it's me again. Just wanted to say I liked our little walk last night. Let's do it again soon." My heart was pounding so hard I could barely think. How did he know I'd gone for a walk? Was he watching me now? The next day, I tried to act like nothing had happened. I went to school, hung out with Matt, and pretended everything was normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I glanced at my phone, I half expected another text or call. By the time I got home, I was exhausted. I had just started on my homework when I got a notification from Instagram. It was a follow request from a private account with no profile picture. The username? John_watches. My stomach churned. There was no doubt now, this guy wasn't just some random creep. He was targeting me. I didn't accept the request, but I also didn't block it right away. Instead, I showed it to Matt the next morning. He laughed, like he always does when he's nervous, and said, "Dude, it's probably some bot or a prank. Just block it and forget about it." So, I did. But that same night, I got another follow request. This time, the username was even worse, Elm Street Pete. My hands were shaking as I deleted it. Somehow, he knew my street. I shut all the curtains in my room and locked my door. I even checked under my bed, feeling ridiculous but too scared to care. That night, I barely slept. Every little sound, the wind, a car passing outside, felt like a threat. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow move past my bedroom window, but when I peeked through the blinds, the yard was empty. The next morning, I decided to tell my parents. My mom brushed it off, saying it was probably just someone trying to scare me, but my dad got serious. "If this guy contacts you again, we're going to the police," he said. I hoped it wouldn't come to that, but deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Later that afternoon, I decided to go for a walk again, this time during daylight. I needed to prove to myself that I wasn't going to let this guy control my life. Everything seemed fine at first. The streets were busy, people were out walking their dogs, and I started to feel a little more normal. But as I turned the corner toward the park, my heart sank. Sitting on the same bench where I'd first seen him was the guy. He wasn't smoking this time, just sitting there, staring straight ahead. I froze, hoping he wouldn't notice me, but then he looked right at me and smiled, like he was happy to see me. I turned around and walked away as fast as I could without outright running. My palms were sweaty, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting him to follow me. But when I looked back, he was still sitting there, just watching. That should have been a relief, but it wasn't. It felt like a warning. I went straight home, locked all the doors, and told myself I'd stay inside until this whole thing blew over. But then, around 9 p.m., the calls started again, this time from another unknown number. At first, I ignored them, but the ringing wouldn't stop. After the 5th call, I picked up, ready to yell at whoever was on the other end. But all I heard was silence. Not the kind of silence where someone's waiting to talk. This was the kind where you can tell someone's there, listening. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice cracking. Still nothing. Then, just as I was about to hang up, he finally spoke. "You shouldn't have walked away." His voice was low and calm, like he was scolding me for breaking some unspoken rule. I hung up and threw my phone across the room, my whole body shaking. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept thinking about what he said, replaying it over and over in my head. You shouldn't have walked away. What did that mean? Was he angry? Was it a threat? Every creak in the house felt amplified, like the walls were closing in. At one point, I thought about calling the police, but what would I even tell them? I had no proof he was dangerous. Just a few creepy texts, some calls, and a gut feeling that something was really, really wrong. The next morning, I tried to carry on like normal, but I felt like a zombie. I was jumpy all day, my heart racing every time someone got too close. When I got home, there was an envelope on the front porch with my name written on it in black marker. No stamp, no return address. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. Inside was a single piece of paper with 4 words. "See you tonight, Pete." That's when I completely lost it. I showed the note to my parents, and this time, my dad didn't hesitate. He called the police. The police showed up about an hour later. I could tell they were trying to be reassuring, but their questions made it clear they didn't think this was serious. They asked if I had any enemies or if I was playing some kind of prank. When I showed them the texts, the voicemail, and the note, one of the officers sighed and said, "We'll file a report, but without an actual threat, there's not much we can do." Not much they could do. There was a guy stalking me, and they were acting like it was no big deal. Before they left, they said they'd patrol the area that night, which didn't make me feel any safer. By the time the sun went down, I was completely on edge. My parents tried to act normal, but I could see how worried they were, especially my dad. He stayed up watching TV in the living room, but I think he just wanted to keep an eye on the front door. I locked myself in my room and pushed my dresser in front of the window, just in case. Around midnight, I started hearing noises outside, quiet at first, like someone walking on the grass. Then came the tapping. Soft, deliberate, rhythmic, like someone drumming their fingers against the glass. My blood ran cold. I didn't want to look, but it was like my body acted on its own. Slowly, I turned toward the window. Through a small gap between the blinds and the frame, I saw him, Pete or John or whoever he was, standing there. He wasn't smiling this time. His face was blank, almost bored, but his eyes were locked on mine. He tapped on the glass again, and I froze, unsure of what to do. My phone was on the other side of the room, and calling for my dad didn't feel like an option. It was like the air had been sucked out of the room, and I couldn't make a sound. Then he leaned closer to the window, his breath fogging up the glass. He mouthed something I couldn't make out, but I didn't need to. The way he looked at me was enough to send me scrambling for my phone. I dialed 911, whispering into the receiver while trying not to cry. The operator kept asking me to stay calm, but how could I? There was a man outside my window. When I glanced back, he was gone. Just like that. The tapping had stopped, and the yard was empty. By the time the police arrived, there was no trace of him, no footprints, no sign he'd ever been there at all. The police searched the yard and the surrounding streets but didn't find anything. They told my parents the same thing they'd said before. Without a direct threat or evidence of a crime, there wasn't much they could do. My dad argued with them, but it was no use. After they left, my mom insisted I sleep in their room for the night, and even though it felt childish, I didn't argue. I spent the whole night staring at their bedroom door, waiting for the sound of tapping to start again. But it never did. The next day, things felt off. I kept expecting him to show up again, but nothing happened. No calls, no texts, no weird Instagram requests. It was like he had vanished. For a while, I thought maybe he'd gotten bored or moved on to someone else, but the fear never really went away. Even now, years later, I still get nervous when my phone buzzes or when I hear footsteps behind me at night. I never found out who he was or what he wanted, and that's what haunts me the most. He could still be out there, watching, waiting. And the worst part? I'd never see it coming.